Thank you, patient, wonderful audience. My name's Jennifer Dorr, and I'm the co-founder of the Open Book, Open Mind series and a trustee of the Montclair Public Library Foundation. This series is generously sponsored by the Montclair Foundation, Investors Foundation, and the Montclair Public Library Foundation, and we couldn't do these talks without their help and, of course, without the support of our community, you. So thank you so much if you donate to the library. We really appreciate it. Tonight's talk is a really great example of how very grassroots this series is. Our moderator, DT Max, is a member of our advisory board on the Open Book, Open Mind series. We have this awesome advisory board of Montclair authors and publishers, and it's just so rich, this town. And they tell me what to do. And Dan is the one who brought this book to my attention. It's a work of such courageous journalism, and I really appreciate that. In Antisocial, Andrew Marantz documents how the extreme became mainstream, how the truth became fake news, how fringe ideas spread, and how a candidate many dismissed as a joke, I was one of those people, was propelled to the presidency by the dark side of the internet. For several years, he was embedded with alt-right propagandists who have become experts at using social media to advance their corrosive agenda. Andrew Marantz is a staff writer at The New Yorker, where he has worked since 2011. His work has also appeared in Harper's, New York, Mother Jones, The New York Times, and many other publications. Today, Andrew will be in conversation with DT Max, who I mentioned, who's also a staff writer at The New Yorker, who continues to delight us with his wonderful articles. He's a Montclair resident and a huge advocate for writers and writing. And we're so lucky to have people like him in our town. His book, Every Love Story is a Ghost Story, A Life of David Foster Wallace, was a New York Times bestseller and is just a stunning, moving read. He's also the author of The Family That Couldn't Sleep, A Medical Mystery. He has been the books editor of the New York Observer, a writer for the New York Times Magazine, and a food reviewer for Paper. I just wanted to say, I just wanted to nudge you all to buy the book in the lobby afterwards, because it's really, book sales are the only way that we can really compensate our authors. They come, they donate their time, and the way that we keep great authors of this caliber coming to town who donate their time is to buy the book. So if you could do that, we would be so appreciative. Plus, it's an amazing book. So thank you so much. Please remember to turn off your phones, and thanks for coming today. I'm going to welcome our guests out to speak.
This thing on? Yeah? Okay.
All right, well, thank you all for coming out. I'm wearing my Steve Bannon outfit for the event, so. But it's a huge honor. Andrew and I have worked together at The New Yorker, and you know, we couldn't figure out what he was doing. He spent a huge amount of time in his office online looking at some really creepy things. And none of us had, you know, frankly, this when Andrew started his research in this area, it was really essentially unknown territory. I mean, there was just this thing happening, and we were all hearing about social media and how it was influencing politics and sort of the presence of a kind of a hard right element online. And it's all very vague, as most things are on the internet if you're not on them. And there would be Andrew, and he'd be talking, having a very civilized conversation, let's say, for argument's sake, about La Boheme. And then the most appalling things were scrolling on his computer as he went by. So I think my first question for you is, maybe because I think people heard the summary of the book, you know, why you, why this?
Yeah, well, so why me, why this? It was something I struggled with too, because there is this element of, as you say, sitting in the New Yorker office and sort of saying, am I sort of somehow sullying myself or the institution with just the IP addresses I'm visiting? You know, on any given day, you would have, and I go into this a little bit, where you would have, you know, somebody walk by the office and say, oh, you're reading up on an essay called The Rational Racist, or, you know, why misogyny is actually great, you know, it's sourced back to Aristotle and all these things. And it's the kind of thing where you kind of have to contextualize, let's say, when somebody walks into your office. the reason I was looking at that stuff was not to be convinced or to bring it into some kind of, rational argument with polite society, but it was, as you say, something was happening, right? And nobody could really figure out what it was. And I had been looking at this stuff before it seemed at all political to me, and sort of 2014, I guess, would be the start of it, when I went to Chicago to do a piece about this clickbait factory. And
Just have to say with that I think.
So I mean, you can imagine so much of our online architecture is built around getting people to click on stuff, getting people to share stuff. There has always been sensationalism, there has always been fake news, there has always been bigotry. These things were not invented by the internet, but the internet fundamentally changes the way information is disseminated, right? So when you have algorithmic, personalized algorithms that feed you stories, you're no longer doing the thing where you go pick up your favorite newspaper or go online and find the homepage of your favorite newspaper. You're going to Facebook or Twitter or Snapchat or whatever. I could keep listing platforms in descending order of how likely you guys are to use them, but they all go into the feed model rather than the sort of editorial intelligence curating things for you model. When that starts to happen, the question in my mind was, what does that do to our psyche? What does that do to our informational infrastructure? What does that do to our politics? What does that do to our daily lives?
And you reminded me of something I forgot, which is true that Andrew began this really as an investigation into marketing.
Right.
In a funny way. So the example of clickbait is, 10 reasons people fall out of love, the answer may surprise you, And this stuff is still around. I mean, it's kind of past its heyday, I guess, so we talk about that.
Right.
But I can't remember if in those early pieces, and the book's foundation, though not the book itself, came out of these New Yorker pieces. Were you already alive to the political, propagandistic?
I think hypothetically, right? So when I was looking at this clickbait stuff, there's no reason in principle why it can't be the 10 reasons that the border is destabilizing our economy. Number 9 will shock you. Like that, there's no reason in principle that it can be one and not the other. So I sort of knew hypothetically that the same tricks, and these tricks evolve, right? So you don't see that headline architecture anymore, but you see another one that's designed to do the same thing. It sort of occurred to me, right, that could become political, but it didn't seem real to me until there was a certain escalator ride that I think we all saw, that it just sort of seemed like, okay, well now that moment has arrived. The hypothetical timeline has merged with the actual timeline.
And when was that moment for you? It was before Trump's election, obviously.
It was before Trump's election. Yeah, it was when he just, I was going to say walked down the escalator, but he just kind of stood on the escalator, and it just sort of carried him down, sort of looking like both confused and very cocksure. And that was June 2015. And from that moment, immediately this all seems very quaint to recount now, but there was this immediate, this is a joke, this is never going to happen. Whereas since I had been so steeped in the attention economy, as people sometimes call it, it just seemed to me like, okay, there is clearly one person in this entire field of people who is good at nothing other than getting attention and keeping it. And we live increasingly in an intentional economy, so why would this not work? I mean, there was like about a window of a week or so where I was kind of waiting for him to be laughed out of the room. And that happened, but it didn't happen widely enough. And then I thought, oh, well, he's going to win. So then I became a very depressing person to hang around in the office.
But did you know, this is slightly off theme, but there is a moment in the book where you talk about the sort of surprise at Trump's victory. Did you have an insight that most of the people at the New Yorker did not have? I don't remember, you're probably too modest to state it in the book, but I do remember that there's a moment you mentioned in the book where the New Yorker had prepared a long list of terrific pieces to run to go along with Hillary Clinton's election, and then the question was, well, what do you have if Donald Trump wins? And there was just nothing waiting. I mean, there was no prepared piece in at all, and so they being fast on their feet, they came up with something. But nobody in the broader magazine anticipated the end, which is, I mean, sort of not surprising in a way. But you did know, you had a feeling.
I did. I mean, Remnick owes me a brownie.
Yeah.
We had a bet.
Oh wow.
He still never paid up. I felt like it would have been cruel to.
In Colorado, huh?
Yeah. But just a regular brownie. But that. First of all, I mean.
What was your first? When was the moment you knew?
Well, so it seemed plausible to me the whole time because it really was about a week of okay, this moment is going to pass, and then it didn't pass. I mean, we forget he was the front runner the entire time, but. Then I mean, look, it goes beyond Trump. It's actually, Trump doesn't show up that much by name in the book. Obviously, he hovers over the book, but, or just sort of under it or whatever. But he's just, what I was looking for with Trump, with this clickbait mill in Chicago, with some of the miscreants and fascists and liars who we'll get into, these are all examples of a phenomenon. They themselves aren't the phenomenon I was after. And I think it's a mistake people sometimes make, I think, just with the form of the kind of work we do, is that people attach to the thing itself when really the thing is a vehicle for a larger set of concerns, a larger set of concepts.
Right.
So people sort of attach to the specifics of the people that you are charting psychologically or biographically or whatever, when really what's interesting is the forces that create them and allow them to succeed. So the forces that had allowed someone like Trump to become plausible in the first place, those forces were powerful enough, I thought, that they could, that the old rules didn't apply. And one of the sort of basic metrics I applied to it was every election kind of has a different medium that is kind of, people will say, well, 2008 was the BuzzFeed election, or 2012 was the whatever election. By any measure, 2016 and now 2020 and beyond are the social media election. Right. And because of what I was sort of starting to get at before about how things get chopped up into feeds and then kind of recontextualized into this just clotted stream of everything kind of merging together, there's just a flattening that takes place. I like to try to have a counter in my mind of how many mixed metaphors I use in any one of these things, but there's a kind of people call it a stream or a feed, and I think that's not incidental because the stream just gets clotted with all kinds of stuff, and it's all just a bunch of shiny objects, and it's impossible to tell what's a candy wrapper and what's a flower. It just kind of, you're just grasping at the nearest thing.
But I mean, when you began, so when I read this book, there are a couple things that shocked me, well, many things that shocked me. Among them was that kind of repulsive speech, or speech that I find repulsive in these extreme right-wing channels and sites, and they're probably not sites any of you will go to. And since Andrew started the book and finished the book, Facebook and Twitter have progressively push the people who are narrated in the story, and it's really a story about people who have kind of, what's the red pill metaphor is anyone who's seen The Matrix here, you don't really have to see The Matrix, you only have to know one thing about The Matrix, which is a movie with Keanu Reeves, which I myself always found unwatchable, but what's the one thing we need to know about The Matrix? You'll need this for any conversation. The one thing about The Matrix
There's a scene with Keanu Reeves and Lawrence Fishburne, and he's welcoming him down the rabbit hole, which is the Alice in Wonderland metaphor, or you could use the Plato's Cave metaphor. They're all the same, which is everything you've seen up till now is a lie, and if you take this pill, you'll realize the truth. That pill is the red pill.
Right. And if you take the white pill, you can go back to being a productive, ordinary citizen living in this lie. So all the people who Andrew writes about believe that they have abandoned conventional misinformation, swallowed the red pill, and found the truth about what goes on in our world, in our culture, in our politics, in our military. But the first thing that surprised me about this world, which I knew very little about before Andrew started investigating it, is that they have an almost extraordinarily complicated sense of humor. It's not what you think. If you can capture a little bit about how they talk and how they trick what they call norms, which is most of us, I'm assuming, in this room, into looking like fools. I thought that was a huge part of what they do.
It is, yeah, and the humor, the wit and intelligence is actually a tough thing to grapple with. I actually had, speaking of the kind of machinations of the New Yorker office, which end up being a little bit more of a character in the book than I was planning on, because it's a book about media production and how it can go awry, and so I felt like it would be dishonest not to use our kind of media production as a foil against that, because that's in reality what was that's what the dynamic was.
And because
as it was.
they have such a when Andrew shows up with his little New Yorker badge,
Yeah.
it's kind of like I don't know. I mean, it's not quite like being someone from the Times, but because they kind of pitied you, really.
Yeah, yeah.
They like pitied this guy who came full of his sort of fluff and fancy feathers, but who like couldn't get 100,000 followers on Twitter
Exactly.
in 2 days.
Yeah.
Which they could do.
Right, and so they would keep sort of saying like, we can help you.
Right.
Like, do you? And it was like,
He was like their pet. I mean, you played it very well. He was the embedded pet, which is the best kind of pet to be, I think, as a
yeah, they called me the embed, and they kind of feared me and pitted me, and sort of said like, are you sure you don't want us to juice your stats? And I was like, I'm sure you could do it, but I also think I would probably get fired and maybe like not be able to sleep at night. So whatever you do, I mean, the book is in large part about what they do to get there, and it's not.
But they also wanted you to take the red pill, right?
Yes,
I mean, they
yes.
believed Andrew was simply wrong. I mean, it's almost like a religious mindset, right?
Mm-hmm.
Where they're affable in your presence, but they're relentless in their belief.
Yeah, yeah, and there's a range too, right? There are people who are just sort of in it for the money. I mean, I think the parts that you'll hear from the platforms themselves when they talk about like problems of fake news or misinformation, the one that, if you're listening to like a Facebook PR person, they want to talk about the ones that are for financial gain, right? Because those are the ones where if they change the incentives, the problem will go away. So they'll talk about the kids in Macedonia who are just trying to get clicks in order to make ad revenue. The parts that are thornier are the people who are true ideologues, right? Who are like actual neo-Nazis, actual misogynists, or just actual wanting to just, there's a sort of one of these recurrent phrases in the book, some people just want to watch the world burn. There are just some kind of, nihilism almost becomes its own kind of ideology. So that is much tougher. There's no real incentive tweak that can make that go away. And there's a whole range, right? There are people who just get addicted to the dopamine rush. There are people who just like seeing traditional normies, as you say, be bewildered and so there's a
playground aspect
yeah.
to what they're doing. What I think one thing Andrew does beautifully is, and I was going to read a few of the names because this is really a book about people who have gone over to the other side. One of them, curiously enough, from a Montclair family, and we can get to that in a moment. But and most of these names you probably, unless you have the misfortune to be doing what Andrew had to do and going deep as an embed, you probably won't know, right? I mean,
yeah, and I think that's fine. I don't think that's.
And I was going to ask you I don't think that this book these people already have hundreds of thousands of followers. So if they were in this room and I said, how do you feel about giving them attention?
Right.
They would die howling with laughter because,
Right.
they're already got attention. But they didn't have the kind of high level intelligence that Andrew brings to bear on them. They mostly had fans. And so talk about, there's a couple of very central to the book. And I wondered if you would maybe bring up a couple who represent the different things you're talking about. So one person who gets a lot of time is a guy named Mike Cernovich. And if you'd explain why so there's all right, there's all light, you just give us a little bit of, because it's a really fine kind of discussion of what, this isn't about one group, it's about 50, 100, 100 groups.
Right, well, there were only a few things they could agree on, one of which was, it'll be nice if Trump wins because it'll really freak out the normies. And another thing they could agree on is, broadly speaking, some version of nationalism, right? But there are lots of different kinds of nationalism. Some are white nationalists, some are not. The guy you mentioned, Cernovich, he's married to a woman whose parents are from Iran and who doesn't consider herself white. Some people are more into Islamophobia than others. Some people are really into anti-Semitism. Some people are actually fine with the Jews and really into Israel and all that stuff. So I always kind of had to wonder when I walked into a room, like, I'm not going to deny being Jewish if they ask me, but I might not lead with that. And when you say,
There's a charming moment where somebody thinks because Andrew has red hair that he couldn't possibly be Jewish. That person is poorly informed.
That
person has not been in this part of the world.
You did not do proper
research.
Googling, yeah. And it's funny how many people
you're
are
Scottish, aren't you?
Yeah, it's funny how many people
Thereabouts.
I encountered who are professional, full-time anti-Semites for a living. Like, they get their Bitcoin donations for being anti-Semites, and they're just not very good at knowing who the Jews are. Like, that's your main job, dude. You should probably get better at it.
Never met one. But Cernovich is not that animal.
He's not that. In fact, he's more interested in, trolling is an overused an
But I think you may have to tell
defined
us.
word. But yeah, trolling started as this thing that people would do on message boards as a kind of pranking to get a rise out of people, to make people feel emotions that they would then feel silly for having felt. I mean, it was really just a kind of innocent pranking, pretending to be someone you're not, making people get outraged over nothing.
You know when someone says to you, you used to say, like, just yanking your chain.
Right.
Like, trolling is basically just getting a rise out of someone.
Right, that was the initial thing, and it was kind of attached to this kind of like almost shock jock, drive time radio culture. And then it, like so many other things, the longer the internet stayed with us, the darker and darker it got, until trolling became this thing of like, well, I'm just, trying to exercise my free speech rights by, using this racial slur, or by, just publishing this innocent person's address, that's trolling. When in fact that's just sort of like dangerous forms of brigading or, hate speech or whatever. But they, like so many things on the internet, they kind of merged into one thing. So someone like Cernovich, so he's a good example. The reason he gets so much time in the book, again, because these people are examples of the larger phenomenon I'm after, he is a good example of something where,
Well, he had a huge, was it a Twitter following? Where was
mostly
he did
Twitter, but also Periscope, Instagram. There's a lot of platform diversification. In case you
Right.
get kicked off of one, you can go onto the other.
So these are just ways he would do his thing that,
So-
that you could find on the internet.
And it wasn't only, so it was directed in the sense that, so he was a lawyer, he was a very sharp guy, very well-read guy. This is another thing I was going to get to before when you talk about the
Not
wit.
that well read.
Well,
Like Bannon well read.
sure, right. So yes, so not, yes, like, it depends what metric we're using. Like, good at faking through things in a cocktail party kind of way, or even better, a cocktail party like your Periscope feed, your live video feed, where nobody can talk back to you and quiz you on anything. So there's a kind of well-read where you can talk to a camera,
Right.
where you're never going to get
Right.
asked any specific question.
Yeah, he's part of this world who kind of dipped into what interested him to reinforce the beliefs that he was already
Exactly.
forming, and he would read things, or at least appear to read them. This is all based on Andrew's reporting, that are hard to read. I
Yeah.
mean, he was intellectually avid in the way that I think certain kinds of people who really want to achieve a goal, and it has to be kind of fully decked out in intellectual uniform. But I don't think he ever read, well, maybe when he's younger, you would know. Did he ever read just to figure out what he wanted to support, or?
I think so. A lot of the people, I would say a majority of the people in the book did not originate. I mean, there was no alt-right when they were forming their
Right.
intellectual beliefs. There was racism.
Some were
There
on the
was
left even.
Many, I think most were on the left. Most of the people, so I start out at this inauguration party called the Deplorable, which
Right.
is a very funny
Yeah,
party.
and in a way, I mean, see if you would agree with this. In a way, the original phrase that I almost feel the whole movement in the book come from is Hillary Clinton, and you write about this rather odd discussion about the basket of deplorables.
Right.
Does everyone remember this?
Yeah.
Which I felt, because I'm a normie, like that was going to be the knockout blow to the deplorables. And instead, of course, it was a perfect example actually of trolling, of what Andrew was saying. So they got a rise out of her. She looked kind of dumb and schoolmarmish, which is all part of a victorious troll. And then they themselves appropriated the idea of themselves as outside of the mainstream to gain energy.
Right.
I mean, it's actually, in that sense, exactly what all of the people you write
Right.
about do online.
Right, and
So-
part of, and I think it's important to note there that it seems as if the correct answer then is to
Be less deplorable.
be, well, not for them. I mean,
sorry.
for the normies. If the correct answer for them is lots of things, but they're not going to listen to that. The correct answer, though, for us is, it seems, to just not let their memes escape our lips, right? If what they want is for Hillary Clinton to give a speech repeating how despicable a lot of these Breitbart headlines are, it seems like the answer is, well, just don't feed the trolls, right? That's one of the oldest maxims of the internet.
Right.
Don't feed the trolls. And the way you feed them is by giving them any attention, any oxygen at all. And the reason that I think trolls are so ingenious is that neither of those answers is a good answer. It's not a good answer to give them negative attention because that's what they want. It's not a good answer necessarily to always ignore them. Sorry for the split infinitive, because if you always ignore them, they seem like they're winning, right? If you just let Breitbart publish articles called "Is it worse to have feminism or cancer?" then you don't, and you let that go unchallenged by the rest of the internet, you're acting as if that's just a part of the discourse that we can just allow to exist unchallenged, right? So there actually is no, once this barrier is broken, there is really no good way out. Add that to the metaphor counter. So, but what I was going to say about the problem of wit, you were saying earlier that it presents this weird kind of challenge, how often these people can be unexpectedly witty, unexpectedly sharp. I actually had a fact-checking dilemma about this at the New Yorker, where I came, one of these sort of dispatches from my embedding with these people. I wanted to describe a neo-Nazi as smart. I think the phrase was the smartest person in his family. And the checker sort of said, well, I believe that the family told you that. So the quote, I'm not challenging that the quote happened, I'm challenging the content of the quote because nobody who ends up in this place could be that smart.
Right.
And so we actually had this kind of sort of deep epistemic tussle over this at the closing meeting where I was sort of saying, well, I guess it depends what you mean by smart, but I take it to mean that, being a good person and being an intelligent person are actually independent variables, which is, to me, much more terrifying.
For sure, yeah. And
we changed
what
it
you compromised on
clever.
on clever.
That
You
was
know,
a-
it
that was
reminds me
Gertrude's
that
idea,
my nephew, I was just spending some time with my nephew, and he has internet skills that I don't really possess. And he told me that somewhere online there's somebody trolling the fact checker for something that you did.
Yeah.
Which I didn't, of course,
Yeah.
know about.
Yeah.
So they didn't leave Andrew alone. I mean, it's interesting. I know these are the rules of these people or not, but no, I don't think anyone ever physically menaced you in any way. It's more this odd kind of game that's also not a game. And one thing that they did to Andrew, which you expected, obviously, because you knew was coming, was to kind of poke at him endlessly.
Right.
Like, it's all a joke, and you as this reporter trying to make us a serious force are even a bigger joke.
Right.
So what is, I just didn't know what was online, but
Yeah.
there's actually a tape of them in your fact checker?
Yeah, there's a lot of people who will record everything.
Right, they're
that
big
you do.
recorders.
Yeah, because it's a way to take the power back. And it is, in a way, what I was saying earlier about the kind of flattening of all... The internet, and especially the social internet, which they called Web 2.0, the whole project was to flatten all power structures, right? The original, I spend a lot of time at the offices of Reddit in the book. The original sort of slogan of Reddit, which is one of these big social networks, is freedom from the press. That wasn't them
That
being...
I didn't know that.
Yeah, that wasn't them being alt-right or whatever. That was just them being cool techno-libertarian badasses, right? Everybody, it's a very safe assumption that a majority of people are going to have fun defining themselves in opposition to the press. Now we can get into what does the press mean or whatever, but the whole notion of the social internet was nobody's going to tell you what to think or say. You're the person who gets to decide what you want to say, and if it gets more upvotes, then it wins. It's just democracy in its purest form. So part of that project expands outward. I mean, the reason that the subtitle is about Techno-Utopians and online extremists is that they unwittingly or wittingly reinforced each other. The Techno-Utopians created this system where they were going to topple all hierarchies, smash all gatekeepers. What they either didn't realize or didn't admit was that they themselves became gatekeepers in the process of doing that, because their algorithms now define how all people essentially on Earth understand and perceive their reality. And then by abdicating the responsibility to be gatekeepers, they let a power vacuum form, and these are the people who flooded into it.
But each of these people is slightly different, which one of the things I found so fascinating about the book. So my impression was that the alt-right is this group, I now know it was sort of incorrectly called, but was called for a while by people like me who only knew a little something, was again that they were sort of just this very kind of very straightforward, dark, neo-fascist, kind of like, early Mussolini types. But in fact, and Andrew does a lovely job of this, they're very American in the sense that they come from everywhere. They have multiple contradictions. You mentioned Cernovich, who's married to a woman of, is it Persian?
Yeah.
But he doesn't, but the weird thing is, he doesn't see it as a contradiction.
Right.
So we can talk about our own, astonishingly, our own hometown extremist, who is another highly contradictory person. This was a piece that ran originally in different form in the New Yorker. And it's probably a name none of you know, but what was his nom de guerre?
The nom de guerre was Enoch. Mike
Right.
Enoch. And that...
and what was he doing online? He was prominent.
Yeah, well, so this is another example that basically everyone that I spend a lot of time detailing in the book starts somewhere else on their journey, right? So they'll start on the left and then go through various permutations of left libertarianism, anarcho-capitalism, and I can go through, I mean, there's actually many pages devoted to exactly how that transition works, because it seems counterintuitive how you go from, you know, Trotskyite to Nazi in a few, you know, intellectual leaps.
But a lot of them are just sort of doing nothing, too.
Right, some of them are doing nothing, but some of this actually does come out of reading. So the basic, I mean, it's the very short version is, if you want to do like a kind of left libertarian thing where the state is a hindrance to freedom, and then you can go to what they call anarcho-capitalism, which is, okay, well then we can't have anything but freedom of covenant, and then, well, why is the government telling us that we can't have the freedom of covenant to only form agreements with other white people, because that's what, you know, makes us feel more comfortable, and that's, they, you know, can create a lot of sort of pseudo-social science to, you know, make it seem that that's how you create a prosperous and safe society. All of which is just to say that these are not people who were born or raised to think these things. These are people who have the zeal of recent converts. And so, yeah, there was a guy who grew up right here who was, before he got red-pilled, had married a Jewish woman, had a black brother who was adopted, had lived in New York City, worked as a computer programmer. So I mean,
He did. This is the
the Nazi guy. Yeah. So there are not. It's not what you would expect on paper, and that to me made it much more interesting just from my own journalistic curiosity. But I think it also, you know, the people who are doing this propaganda, you know, the people that I was focusing on are the people who are the kind of the master propagandists of the movement. It wasn't just sort of normal rank and file converts. And I was interested in them because they know exactly what they're doing. They're not, these are people who are reading enough to know what the context is. So yeah, they will start, you know, in this case, there was a podcast that he called The Daily Shoah that...
you have to say a little bit slower.
Yeah, Shoah.
The Daily Shoah was his idea. That's what we're getting at, like a very odd combination of the cringing, the funny.
Yeah.
And if you wince, then he's got you.
Right.
Right? But
And
if
how
you
could
say
you not?
nothing,
Yeah.
But if you say nothing, he's got you.
Right. So that's the thing, and so these are not, you know, The Daily Shoah is not, you know, the top downloaded podcast on iTunes or anything, but these are, because these are propaganda movements, they don't have to be, right? It doesn't have to be that these things are sweeping the nation. What it has to be is that these are memes in the classic Richard Dawkins sense, not in the, so memes, sometimes when you hear a kid using the phrase meme, it means, you know, a picture with words on it, or like, you know.
Right.
So, but the actual meme concept comes out of evolutionary genetics, that just as genes perpetuate themselves through evolution in species, so do memes, ideas, catchphrases, tunes, anything can evolve through culture. And that happens through, in the old days, it happens through mouth-to-mouth, word-to-word, you know, word-of-mouth transmission. Now it can happen at literally an unprecedented scale. So the memes that are the most successful don't have to necessarily reach the most people right away. They can be propagated through various channels. You know, a lot of the guys in my book talk about the alt-right to Tucker pipeline. Mm-hmm. So they can, if they can get one of their memes to Tucker Carlson, they don't have to, it doesn't have to be viral on Facebook necessarily. It can go out through that channel. Or, you know, to get back to why I spent so much time in Mike Cernovich's house, you know, I was curious to see where he lived, and I went out to Orange County, California, and sat in his very nice condo with his wife and kid, and, you know, they went out for nice walks in the morning and then, you know, sat down and wreaked havoc on the internet. But the way he did it, I mean, I was interested in just the scene and the color, but the way he did it was by understanding how meme propagation works at a very deep level, and there was no one teaching him this. He just sort of reverse engineered it. So he could sit down and say, okay, I'm going to put my iPad here, I'm going to start a Periscope video, which is a live stream app that's connected to Twitter. And again, you don't have to have 1 million people in your Periscope stream. You could have 1,000. But if they're all your hardcore fans and they're all obeying the letter of what you're telling them to do, if you say, okay, here's the deal. We're going to insinuate that Hillary has a neurodegenerative illness that they're not telling you about, right? Because if you're red-pilled, you know that the official narrative is always wrong. So then you just insinuate, you just create a hashtag that says sick Hillary or whatever, and it doesn't have to be in the context of a presidential election. It can just be whatever, why we need to close the border or the immigrant caravan or I mean, we know all these memes by now. And if you pick the right hashtag and if you find the right images that are resonant enough and create the right kinds of emotion that get everyone engaged, whether they love you or hate you or whatever, that just get you to wince or react, then those 1,000 people can get it trending on Twitter. It doesn't have to be the most volume on Twitter to get it trending. It just has to be moving really fast because they're looking for virality. Once it's trending on Twitter, then all the journalists who are on Twitter, which is to say all the journalists, right, then see it, and then some proportion of those journalists are going to write about it, and then it becomes a valid topic of conversation. So then you start to see the pieces that say, well, to be sure, nobody has confirmed, but some people are saying that Hillary might have this neurodegenerative disorder, or critics might say that there isn't really an immigrant caravan, but this is now a topic of conversation.
What's like a current meme that's sort of achieving that right now, assuming this is still going on?
Oh yeah, I mean everything in the information war over impeachment, everything in the information war over the future of Europe, the elections in Israel, the election. I mean, you really pick anything that a lot of eyeballs are on, and it's a site of informational warfare.
But like one interesting example, just because it was on NPR today, was the recent gun rights rally in Virginia, which it struck me was a very good. I understood that piece much better for having read your book. So this begins with basically a couple thousand very hardcore guns rights activists in full camo and with automatic weapons marched peacefully in Charlottesville on a day that was called Petition Day. There's some day where like you're allowed to go to the Virginia State Capitol and
Petition your grievances.
Yeah, and like say, we really need more of a level crossing, at the train stop in Fulton, Virginia. But they totally appropriated this. But it began, and I thought this was interesting, and I'm sure your people played a role with the misinformation that Virginia, which has just gone Democratic, and is attempting to pass some form of gun control, and maybe they never had gun control before. But it's also an open carry state, which means you just walk down the street with a gun. Was going to confiscate existing weapons from people who had them.
Because it's based on this one moment of hesitation where the governor was asked, and he didn't debunk it right away.
What did he say?
He said, "I'll have to get back to you on that." Which is not a great answer.
Not a great answer. But you see, in another era, that's an answer that the mature media would have just handled and, basically probably waited for him to get back to them on it, But that's not this era, and it's a beautiful opportunity
to fill an information gap. Whenever there's an information gap or a power vacuum, you can seize it, and there always has to be a list of trending topics, right? It's not like those ever take a break or say we're going to wait for tomorrow's morning edition until we can check them.
So suddenly in this narrow world that Andrew's writing about, huge but narrow, you could, with even more basis than they would usually have, say you're going to lose your weapon if you don't march. Right, and these people are already motivated. You're not getting people who haven't never thought about it.
Right, and then, and I think it's important to be clear that these are not happening in a vacuum from, economic issues matter, racial issues matter, demographic issues matter. This isn't to say that, if not for the internet, there wouldn't be cultural anxiety in America or anything like that. It's just that, look, I think, we had this interregnum where I think we grew a little bit too complacent about what the media was or what the news was or what information was, where we said, well, people will eventually arm themselves with the truth, they will educate themselves, the more information, I mean, this was the original dream of the internet, right? The more information that's out there, the more people will know things, and the more people know, the better informed they'll be. And I think we were actually looking a little too much, we were a little too worried about the 1984 scenario and a little not worried enough about the Brave New World scenario, that as long as the government isn't deciding what you're not allowed to look at, we'll be fine. Whereas the Brave New World scenario is you can throw it all out there, and as long as people are too distracted or too numb to see it, it won't have any effect.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that Andrew's book you may dispute this, kind of ends on an optimistic note, which I'd like to examine with you. The Reddit experiment with the flag. Talk, if you would, about. So first of all, you've got a lot of very disquieting moments in this book, as you can imagine.
Yeah.
Basically, it seems pretty clear that nobody can get this genie back in the bottle.
Right.
And Reddit, which is I don't know if those of you don't know, Reddit is one of the most savage of all the kind of social media websites until you read Andrew's book. And then they amazingly become kind of like the sheriff in town, because they at least acknowledge some responsibility for their, like anytime you appear in Reddit, if you're one of us, you know you're gonna be torn to shreds. Like nobody ever says anything nice on Reddit. It's a true unleashing of the id of intelligent people who may not have a better outlet. And yet, you show me it in a different light.
Well, so I was interested in, getting behind the closed doors of as many of these platforms as I could at first, and then it really occurred to me, I mean, first of all, Facebook back then and Twitter back then were like worse than the NSA. I mean, they saw no upside in talking to anyone about anything. Now that's changed because they've had their share of scandals, but it's hard to remember back then that they had this crazy halo effect around them for years and years. I mean, for their whole existence, basically. And then people sort of said, oh, well, there are these issues with privacy and data and all this stuff, and then it kind of exploded in their faces. But really, until about 2015, they were kind of untouchable.
And they were credited with the upside of the Arab Spring. They were credited with the Ukrainian, was it the Orange Revolution?
Yeah. Those were all the Facebook and Twitter revolutions, and it was all, it was all Obama doing, Facebook Live and all these things. So, and again, these strands have always coexisted. It's not as if, I mean, there is this big, scary red book called Antisocial, but it's not as if there aren't pro-social elements to the internet that continue to exist. I mean, there are plenty of Me Too was a hashtag, Black Lives Matter was a hashtag. There's no denying that side of it has always existed. The thing is, though, these were never treated as being in tension. It was just sort of like, it'll all work itself out. Right. And there was this assumption that the arc of history naturally bends toward justice. The marketplace of ideas takes care of itself. It's like this automatic process. And the more freedom we unleash, the better things will be. And it'll just happen automatically. Now, the reason Reddit ultimately fascinated me the most, and I spent the most time there, was A, they let me do whatever I want and see whatever I want, which was great. And the reason they did that is because they got the waves of bad press earlier. People caught on that Reddit could be a really nasty place.
That's right.
And the other social networks always had that, but it just wasn't part of their reputation. Reddit, because of how separate different subreddits are, basically, all right, I'm going to do another metaphor just briefly. Another metaphor I use in the book is of starting a social network is like hosting a party. And each party that you host has different kinds of setting, a different mood, a different, you're either serving champagne flutes or you're serving a tub of grain alcohol. Like you're making decisions, what music to play, whether you have fire exits or not. You're making all these decisions so that then when the people who are hosting the party say, well, don't blame me if there's a stampede because a fire alarm goes off. It's like, well, you should have had an exit, right? There's always some responsibility to the design. Reddit was this big raging warehouse party, but there were lots of different doors you could go to because there are these subreddits where each one is its own different community. And so this was like this massive natural experiment with a million different sets of rules, right?
So in other words, like if you care about,
bird watching or
but even smaller than that.
Science or what happened last night on Grey's Anatomy. There's a subreddit for everything.
Everything. We're talking about tens of thousands?
It's over 1 million now.
Over 1 million different tiny rooms where you can go and discuss. In Reddit, the name actually, it's Reddit. I read it. Like that captures the tone of the people who are initially drawn to it.
Right. So it was supposed to be this natural experiment that was going to show the power of how freedom unleashed on the internet would redound to the good. And the founders were originally fully in line with that techno-libertarian ethos. And they were 23, and they just thought, what could go wrong? We're going to start this thing. We're going to get rich. We're going to free the world. Then they left, sold it to some minor media conglomerate that happens to also own The New Yorker. Then they...
It's so weird. Yeah,
it's weird. It was a little personally awkward for me, but it was fine. Then they... I think they've divested from Condé now, and then they came back. The guy Steve Huffman, who founded this place, came back. These are two guys, Steve Huffman and Alexis Ohanian, who met at the University of Virginia and spent all this time in Charlottesville. This didn't make it into the book, but their original name for the company was Red Brick Solutions because it was founded in Charlottesville, Virginia. Then they come back to this feral warehouse party where people are lighting couches on fire and stuff, and they say, whoa, 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 like, this techno-libertarian thing didn't work out as we planned. And instead of digging in their heels and creating this cognitive dissonance effect where they only proselytize harder, which some other social media founders, Mark Zuckerberg, might be doing these days, they did not do that. They actually said, we might have messed up here. We're not going to just press delete and shut the whole thing down, but we are going to, as you say, lay down some rules. So instead of having the rules at the party be, do whatever you want and good luck and I hope you don't get arrested, they actually said, if you have a subreddit called Fat People Hate, where the rule is come in here if you hate fat people, then no, you're not allowed to have that subreddit anymore. And that's a real example, and it's also the only real example that I will say out loud. There are others in the book that are that are worse, but it gets whatever you can imagine. There's always something worse. So if you want to create that community, we're not going to let you. And this guy Huffman, his feeling was, I brought you into this world, I can take you out of it. Well, I don't owe you this space of servers and pixels. But of course he had inculcated this ethos of, any infringement on my freedom is a slap in the face. So every time he did anything that was taking away something from someone, it was, this is North Korea now, everybody's infringing on my God-given rights, what about the First Amendment?
Yeah, it's a great moment. It's almost like a cartoon moment. Andrew's in the room when they start pulling the plugs on some of these subreddits, as they're called.
Yeah.
And you realize that these things are nothing. I mean, there is somebody, even though you feel like Twitter, Facebook are running on your energy and your content, which they are, they're also coders. They're just people who can alter, who can just remove it in a second.
There's always a person.
And so it's almost like, you can't, like,
yeah. And the reason that happened is because we watched as Charlottesville happened.
Right. So Charlottesville is, in a way, is a very important moment. This is the battle between. Well, you should tell it, but it's the one where the woman is killed by the car.
Yeah. We all remember the tiki torches and all that stuff. This was this moment of national. Even for me, I wasn't until Charlottesville happened. I wasn't planning on going into the really full Nazi territory because it just seemed too grim.
Yeah.
And then I was like, well, I don't really have a choice anymore. But when that happened, these guys who were who founded their company at the University of Virginia, and that company became the platform on which a lot of the white nationalists had organized the rally that ended up killing someone, they just said, all right, shut it down. The phrase that the founder typed to his people was nuke them. If these people are on my platform, nuke them, get them off.
This was like still his platform.
Yeah, and so then they had this war room where they let me watch as they deleted all this stuff, and it was just so weirdly fallible and human, and these people eating these free cheese sticks and drinking kombucha and stuff, doing this. But as I think you point out, it's weirdly sort of humanizing and in a way sort of optimistic to see that they are trying to take back some of this power. Not that they're always going to get it right, and not that stamping out people's freedoms is like a pleasant thing in theory. It's just that they have, I think, the ability to change from a techno-utopian failed ethos to trying to create some kind of new ethos on the fly, in a way is kind of the best we can hope for, right? Is that these new gatekeepers recognize their gatekeeper power.
So I mean, I finished Andrew's book on a joyous and happy note, but then I thought to myself, this sounds awfully good. So we've begun to wrest back the tools of our own destruction from these people. So I just poked around a bit on some of the people. There's a very helpful list of characters. It's the grocery items in the basket of deplorables. And so I looked up a couple that Andrew had happily said had been like bounced off Twitter, and they raised.
Your search algorithm is going to be messed up.
Yeah,
weeks now. Yeah.
I know you get very unpleasant suggestions, and who could no longer, so money fuels all this stuff. And a lot of these people, once they lost the ad revenue of being, say, on Facebook or Twitter, just put out the hat through things like PayPal, and then PayPal knocked them off, and then Visa wouldn't accept credit cards. There's a kind of, as they would point out before anyone else, like there is a kind of authoritarian infrastructure that tolerated them. So I went and looked up a couple of them, and I was astonished to find that. I mean, look at all of them, but like Faith Goldie, who was just a name that appealed to me as so odd. He was a minor figure, almost like a kind of like, I don't know, what was she's she's like, she was Canadian, first of all, which I thought was very interesting. And she was just kind of like a crasher at the party, but extreme. And so I went to her website. I thought maybe she's gone. Like, she's the easy. So she got kicked off of a lot of these sites. And there she is online, and somehow she's got some way to take contributions from me. And some Canadian site is hosting her. So has anyone actually been like totally just...
Well, she's also, Faith Goldie just ran for mayor of Toronto.
Yeah.
So she's, they're not.
She only got 3%.
That's true. No, she didn't do great, but they're not.
3%.
That's true. And yeah, but they're none of them ever totally goes away. I mean,
and someone told me, my nephew, who knows a lot more about this than me, said that Cernovich is so over.
Yes.
And yet he seemed to me to be highly...
Yeah.
Tell me how he's over.
Well, so there's a lot of, I think there is this heartening effect that I think, you're right that there is this rise and fall narrative where, you do, not to spoil the end of the book, but some of these people kind of do get their comeuppance in a way that is satisfying.
Very.
And yet there is this, because as we were talking about earlier, this is about people, but it is also about the systems that are propping up the people. Any one of these people might be deplatformed.
Right.
Alex
I love
Jones.
that word.
Yes, the deplatformed.
That's something here in New Jersey we hear all the time, how the train will not arrive at the platform. So I thought that's what deplatform meant.
Yeah.
So.
You guys are constantly getting deplatformed.
We are.
But that will, it is harder now for Alex Jones to make a living selling snake oil. But he doesn't go away, right? And I think that's, of course, we have a First Amendment for a reason. We don't want to haul people off to jail for preying on people and taking their money. Maybe the SEC should look into him, but not because of his speech, right? But there is an element of if the underlying systems don't get fixed, there will always be another one, right? So you can take out this one or that one,
right.
But it's a game of whack-a-mole. There will always be someone else if the incentives are still in place. If we still have these massive social media feeds that are built on emotional engagement and outrage and incitement and rage bait, that will continue to be, somebody will play to that market. If we don't address the underlying just really sociocultural problems in this country that are being expressed, it's not as if people often have this sort of ask this sort of dichotomous question of like, well, were these sort of raw feelings and hatreds kind of there before the internet, or did the internet stoke them and exacerbate them? And it's like, yes, both. They were there, but we've fed them gasoline, and now the question is, what do we do to, there's this kind of little thread of pragmatist philosophy in there about Richard Rorty kind of talking about how we can find our way to a new moral vocabulary. The reason that's so big and broad and in a way vague is that I think we'd be kidding ourselves if we said, oh, if we pass this antitrust regulation or if we pass this bill, we'll fix the problem. Or even if we got rid of Facebook or this or that company, we would solve the problem. The problem is so much bigger. It's this notion that we've been coasting on this faith that our problems would solve themselves with the march of time, the march of progress, the march of history, and more, of these sort of nice freedoms. I don't want to rest on the flip side of that, of saying that, no, these problems will never solve themselves or will never be solved and we're just doomed to repeat them. I think the real fact of the matter is we have to work our way out. We've built this really hugely knotty and problematic informational ecosystem, just like we've built a really bad climate crisis and a whole bunch of other stuff that we don't expect, oh, that'll just work itself out on its own. We got to fight our way to the solution.
So speaking of being deplatformed, there was a microphone at one point up here. Do we have time for questions, or have we just devoured our okay, so we're open for questions. Anyone who has anything that they want to ask?
Hi, I'm Jacqueline, resident of Montclair. Thank you very much for the speech. My question is, you come across, it seems that the alt-right is portrayed as really purposeful and strategic and expert in technology. Is there no countermeasure? I mean, isn't nobody else as smart to have some sort of moderating view?
Yeah, that's a good question. They're definitely, it's not as if their intelligence that we mentioned is like unmatched or unmatchable. There are plenty of other smart people who are decent people and who are good at information propagation. The issue is that if you have, so this is the thing about trolling, you set the terms you frame the debate around the troll, right? So I think the best that everyone else can do is to kind of reframe the conversation in a new way. But the structural advantages that they do have is that they're working with the grain of the paranoid style in American politics that's always existed, the misogyny, the bigotry that's always existed. There's a study in the journal Science that gets a footnote that it's actually structurally much easier to spread lies than it is to spread actual news, because the actual news is actually kind of confusing and sad and causes this kind of malaise that because the world is really complicated. If you have a very clear story that creates a sharp emotion, you can create a fake story that creates that emotional impact much more cleanly. So there are structural advantages that liars and bigots have, that they don't have to be the smartest person in the room. They can just rely on these undercurrents of human psychology that have always existed. Now, there are people who are pushing back, but I think we should be realistic about the fact that the odds are stacked, actually.
Hi. I wanted to see if you could address maybe a hidden side of this where, like 4chan, so you take people, deplatform them, but you're pushing them into underground platforms where they actually coalesce into dangerous terrorists.
Yeah. Yes, that's a really good point. There is another one of these dichotomies, like the dichotomy of there's no good way to respond to trolls. There's no real good way to deplatform people, because by deplatforming them, as you say, you send them into 8chan as this kind of fetid underground. Again, like imagine the worst thing on the internet and then just sort of multiply that like 500 times.
Now, are these places you need to be invited to?
No,
So why aren't they surveilled in the kind of moderately surveilled the way Twitter is? They have no moderators at all.
No, the structure of the sites is that each one of these sites will crop up when they feel there's too much moderation elsewhere.
Right.
So 4chan was supposed to be a response. When Reddit gets too censorious in their view, they start this site called Vote. When Twitter gets to be too much, they start this thing called Gab. When 4chan seemed to them to be too moderated, they started 8chan, right? So their whole notion is free speech, which we can get into separately why that's a bad argument. But yeah, I do think we have to take seriously this notion of sort of things festering and being left alone to feed on themselves. I will say that there has been research about whether deplatforming reduces the total amount of hate speech or whether it just edges it out somewhere else. And the research suggests that it does actually reduce the overall amount if it's done right, because some people, the reason I keep returning to this party metaphor is that some people are just being influenced by group social dynamics, and if the social dynamics around them are not based on gas chamber memes and anti-Semitic jokes, and if the people are finding other ways to amuse themselves, then these other impressionable, often young people will find other ways to amuse themselves. So you might not be able to get to every, to take yet another metaphor, you could think about it epidemiologically. You might not be able to get to every population center, and some might get worse, but at least you're spreading Purell to as many people as possible. And then there might be some, other people that you have to keep quarantined, and you don't get to all of them, but at least they're on their own.
And does Tucker Carlson, if you're booted off Twitter and wind up on 4chan and booted off 4chan, does he still see what you're posting?
It can always, the way the kind of master metaphor of all this is virality, right? The way that viruses spread, there is nothing that's truly quarantined. So I don't think that there are people, I don't think that Tucker Carlson is just sitting on 8chan between commercial breaks, but things can very easily spread from, there are endless examples of this. There's the example of Donald Trump Jr. using the Skittles meme that there's this thing that says, if I told you that I had a bowl full of Skittles and 3 of them would kill you, would you take them? That is our Syrian refugee problem. That meme that Donald Trump Jr. was tweeting, erroneously, I hopefully don't have to say, was a 4chan meme that was just somebody made, and this thing happens again and again and again. Stuff that when Trump tweeted a photo of Hillary Clinton with a Jewish star on it, that said most corrupt candidate ever, that was a meme that came from Reddit. So these things, and I don't think that it's that they necessarily know where these things are coming from. It's just that metaphor of infection, that it can always spread from one place to another. This is why I'm not so concerned about the numbers. People often want to sort of take a census and say, are the numbers going up or down? To me, it's really about impact and power more than numbers.
And since we're a town full of reporters, if you want to cover this, like, how do you cover it when it's a 24-hour kind of online streaming conversation? Like, how do you capture the worst moments? How do you capture what you need to capture to write a book?
Well, I mean,
you had a baby too, so you...
True. Yeah, I think that the baby helped, actually. It's like one of the best sort of like blue-pilling experiences you can have. But I think it's not
and you were up late at night anyway.
That's true, yeah. It's when all the best stuff happens on the internet. I don't... Well, this is sort of a larger sort of journalistic practice and journalistic ethics question about how much should we be covering. I think how much do we adapt to the always online, always extremely online world by trying to cover all of it and taking that to be our mandate, versus how much do we sort of step back and say, you know what, I'm not going to amplify most of this stuff. I'm going to wait till I find the perfectly demonstrative example and use that as a test case. I mean, that's always been sort of more...
Well, I mean, no sane human being can actually be on these channels all the time, and you have to be committed. You know, I don't know if, I mean, there's a number of ways you can communicate now online besides make a phone call, as many of you probably know. But it's also true that if you're not very attentive to any of these individual channels, you might not notice anything that's going on. I mean, I don't know how many of you have look at Twitter and go, why is this interesting to anyone? You know, because it's somebody's cat, and then it's somebody posting a piece of news that you could see somewhere else. But it's when you get involved in these, you know, and this is why I'm sort of asking how you do it when you have to be, you know, you're a reporter, you got to do other things as well. Did you use software that captured?
Sometimes. I took a lot of screenshots.
Right.
But, so yeah, there was, and you can always set, I mean, these places, all of these various platforms and the people who are good at using them are very good at finding ways to keep you engaged. So you can always set notifications. I got my algorithms to feed me as much of this stuff as possible. So every time I logged on YouTube, the ads I got served were like, do you want to buy a diamond mine with children in it? Like, it just got really, really dark really fast because I was just constantly clicking on all the worst stuff. But that you can get it delivered to your doorstep pretty quickly. So whenever, you know, I mean, I still actually, I feel like I have to just, build a new internet for myself to get those recommendations.
I think we have another question over here.
Question.
Yeah.
My name is Sam. I'm a Montclair resident, and I work in Democratic campaign politics as my full-time thing. But you know, I remember when I was probably in 9th grade, 4chan being a thing. And it was always kind of this depths of hell of the internet. And there was really nothing you could do about it. People just kind of did their thing. And as somebody who is attuned to everything going on a local level, national level, all those types of things, I think that I've noticed one of the problems is that there is an issue with people knowing what the truth of something is, and you have these legitimate sources out there, but when people are talking to each other and they are reinforcing each other's beliefs, they start to kind of think that you know, there's this thing that they are talking about that's right, that's been proven by absolutely nothing. And so you know, I'm kind of wondering, is there a way that we as a society can kind of have some sort of structure out there that is you know, I know Facebook kind of has done a little bit of it, proving or trying to say these are fake sites, taking it off, but in a further way, how do we as a society keep ourselves responsible from getting into that hole of the fake news and information that's out there? How do we keep real information real information?
Yeah. And as you know, 4chan, it's almost worse than fake. It's really directed propaganda. I think, I mean, I think, yeah, you're right that Facebook and all these various people have tried to sort of put labels on things, but, you know, then you have the problem of who's going to trust that label and where does it really come from? And, you know, a big part of the source of this problem in the first place is a sort of a lack of trust in institutions. So, Facebook is kind of the biggest institution we have. So I don't know I think that's better than nothing, but I don't know that that's the answer. I mean, in my reporting experience, a lot of the answer has generally been talking to people. That's not like scalable, as the tech guys say, but it's, I've talked to a lot of people whose brains were broken by 8chan, who I showed them how I do my work, and I showed them where my sourcing comes from, and showed them actually how much I was worried about them falsifying information to me, and them seeing how much I actually was like, okay, I'm gonna need you to send me a picture of your driver's license, I'm gonna need to talk to your mother, and I'm gonna need to, and they're like, whoa, this doesn't seem like what you're doing is fake. So that's not gonna get to everyone, but you'd be surprised how much taking people out one by one, out of that environment, almost in a kind of deprogramming, can be effective. I mean, one of the big chapters, also a New Jersey native, and a woman named Samantha, who is a big chapter in the book, who went very, very far down this rabbit hole and actually found her way to the surface, and it's all through personal relationships. And in that case, it was personal relationships with her brother and actually with me, to come to me and say, hey, I want to talk to a reporter about what I've experienced. You're someone who understands this world but is not kind to it, and can you help me get out? And I actually had this bizarre experience of having endless meetings with this person. This isn't in the book, but I had this endless series of meetings with her where she was still kind of into a lot of sort of Jewish conspiracy theory stuff, and kind of like, I know the Holocaust happened, but did it really happen though? Like, I think it did, but I'm still not sure. And I showed up, and so my name is Marantz, no relation to the audio company, but I showed up with a recorder that I wanted to record our interview on, and it had Marantz emblazoned on it, and I had to explain, like, this isn't part of the Jewish media conspiracy, I don't actually own this company. And she was like, what is going on? Like, her brain was still that broken, and I had to, and so I just watched over the course of a year as she kind of, it was like coming out of a scuba dive or something, like she just had to reacclimate.
Amazing.
It can happen.
Another question.
Hi, I work at a university, and a lot of this sort of stuff happens at the university level too, because they don't exist in a vacuum. So, like, in the news, there's been situations where students have given these sort of very alt-right presentations, presenting them as fact or whatever, or say a professor is sort of sharing his or her beliefs and not backing them up. What role do you think universities can play in these type of conversations, given that the whole purpose of university is to encourage this exchange of ideas, where like it's kind of expected that you don't see eye to eye with the others in your classroom or in your department or whatever? What role do you think universities can play in this, if any, in trying to navigate the sticky situation of not stepping on freedom of speech, but still maintaining some sort of academic integrity as these things are happening?
Yeah, good questions. That is, yeah, I think you're totally right. That is exactly where these things are tested. And this isn't in the book, but I spent a lot of time for the New Yorker reporting at Cal Berkeley, where because it is a public university, and because it's sort of like the big kind of like liberal public university, it gets targeted by a lot of these people who will say, I want to give a speech on your campus, and if you deny me, then that's a First Amendment violation. And in that case, it actually is. Unlike all the other cases that I mentioned that aren't, because it's a private university or a private company. So I think you're right that the purpose of a university is exchange of ideas and academic freedom. The question is, does the mission of the university to promote social harmony for the students and members of the community, and also to promote true information, what to do when those things come into conflict, right? And so often the refuge of these people is to say, you guys are snowflakes, you're afraid of free exchange of ideas, why can't I just express my opinion? And then the question is, well, we don't have climate deniers in our geology department, we don't have alchemists in our chemistry department, why should we have, racists in our psychology department, right? So then the question really, I think one way to get out of these sort of absolutist slippery slope arguments of, if you don't allow X or Y racist demagogue to speak at X or Y university, there's an immediate slippery slope into fascism or, 1984. To me, it's just to recognize that we're always setting lines somewhere. We're always someone's always getting deplatformed, right? There's always someone who wants to speak at Princeton to say that
The Earth is
HIV
flat.
doesn't cause AIDS or the Earth is flat or whatever, and then you just sort of say, no, thank you, we're declining your invitation. I think the reason this stuff has special power is that the United States wasn't built on the proposition that the Earth is flat. The United States was built on many things, including great lofty ideas of freedom, and it was also built on horrific violence and oppression, right? So when you are, again, working with the grain of that kind of oppression and those kind of misbegotten ideas, you then have things to point to where you can say, well, look, there used to be a whole scientific literature about, why my racist ideas are correct. And then it's sort of the role of the university to say, well, actually, that stuff has been debunked. So I think, like trolls, people who are sort of well-footnoted pseudoscientists present a similar challenge, where you don't necessarily want to go too far down the road of legitimizing that conversation, but you also do fuel their sense of indignation when you just tell them they're not worthy of your time. So again, I mean, I would love to have like a one-size-fits-all thing, but it's really case by case. It's like, to me as a journalist, and I think universities could have a similar thing, it's like, if something is below a certain threshold of attention or interest or has a certain lack of following, I might just choose not to add any oxygen to it at all. Once it gets above a certain threshold where somebody is out there and is some kind of, has some kind of public hold on people, then I do think there starts to be a role of saying, okay, how do we debunk this? How do we offer new platforms of information? And to the last person's point, that can't always come from official channels. It can't always be, I, the president of this university, feel that this view is wrong. That helps, that certainly helps, but I think it also has to be like, here's something else you can watch on YouTube that is a little bit less fascisty. Because part of the problem is just an information vacuum, and when someone goes to fill that information vacuum and there's no one else filling it, one of the things that these people often talk about is called the JQ, the Jewish question. One thing I would often find when I would go to like look for, search YouTube for the JQ, there's no one answering the Jewish question the right way, right? So some of it is just being able to point people in a direction that's less harmful.
But it made me ask a question myself, which is, we're in an unusual moment where this group actually has elected the president.
Yeah.
So it's a little bit as if the flat earthers had a
to be
president. Yeah, no, not right, but had the president agreed with them. And I'm curious, many movements are destroyed by success, and yet it doesn't seem to me that this is a movement that was destroyed by success.
Yeah.
That somehow they still managed to have this sort of, to feel the indignity of being shut out, even while paradoxically they have the president.
Yeah.
I mean, not just as a figurehead for their ideas, but somebody who actually, somebody sort of lives the trolling life.
Yeah, well, right. I think that I did have some people say to me, Trump was a really fun meme for a while, but that's not really like a funny meme anymore. But so in a way, some of the air has been taken out of the sails, but I think then the way these things are, it just morphs and evolves, So the meme is no longer that we are this oppressed, transgressive underground, it's that we're taking our country back and we're in the process of making it great, or the deep state is preventing us from making it great, or you can always morph things to suit your agenda.
And in the coming election, maybe our last, or are we about out of?
We have one more?
Oh, we have questions. I'm sorry, I'm not seeing hands.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
Thank you so much. My name is Maureen. I live here in town. One of the circumstances I perceive, and I think is documented, is that we have an increasingly secular society here in the United States. And you talk about this Purell effect, if only we could clean things up and make things nicer. If people haven't heard the 10 Commandments, or they don't know to treat their neighbor, use the golden rule, are we only going to go further and further down this rabbit hole if people really have not had limits set by systems of morality and so forth, perhaps faith systems that clearly delineate how to treat your brother, how to treat your neighbor, and what role then really has an increasing secularism had in the development of this antisocial world that you're talking about?
I think that organized religion can be really good for some people and really not for others. I actually, so when we're talking about different subreddits, one of the most interesting content moderation debates I ever saw was within the subreddit called r/Christianity, between liberal Christians who wanted to promote peace and tolerance and sharing of resources, and biblical literalists who wanted to be able to post that homosexuals and adulterers should be stoned to death. And the Reddit content moderation team had to decide, is that a promotion of violence that we should kick off the platform? It is in Leviticus 18:22, but but it's actually against our rules to promote stoning people to death. So that was actually, I think it just like the Constitution and the Bible, any text that's rich enough can be read to. Both of those documents promote slavery, for example, but they are read, I think, more intelligently to read those things out over time, right? So I guess the short way of saying what I'm saying is it's not a silver bullet. It's really good for some people, and it has helped a lot of people I've known. A lot of the people I've known who have recovered through religion, but it just doesn't work 100% of the time.
And then we had one more.
Sort of related, I'm Cherry from Glen Ridge, and I'm wondering about the rise of the evangelical movement. Have they just tuned in and taken over what you're talking about?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. The certainly as a voting bloc, the evangelicals, and I think in this context we mean the white evangelical movement, has been a very powerful force, and you've seen the Trump campaign or administration, was really the same thing, doing more and more to shore up that support, especially after the Christianity Today op-ed came out. They are going to play as big a role, I think, in 2020 as they did in 2016. And, it's just one of these things where it's sort of like which meme has more emotional resonance with you at which time. Does the meme of the thrice divorced libertine have more of an emotional pull, or does the meme of Neil Gorsuch is going to protect unborn life have more of a pull on you? So, the way we've sort of distilled our politics to be you sort of have to choose one or the other is, I think, kind of dangerous. It doesn't allow for a lot of nuance, but that's just sort of the system we have. So yeah, I think
in your book, book, there's not really much about evangelicals, is there?
Yeah. I mean, I think
these people are, at least as I understand, they're kind of detached.
They're more Nietzscheans than
Christians.
They're
Nietzscheans. They're just
It is kind of the ideology of no ideology, but I do think that these things. There's a lot more randomness and noise in the system than you might think. These things just, as I think we've all seen, these things don't always follow the logical patterns that you would like them to.
Right. So, the evangelicals would, for instance, have the same goal, but their whole approach is far more sincere.
The only consistent ideology, it's not consistent, but the only 60% consistent ideology I've seen in this group is anti-war. Whenever Trump bombs someone, more and more of them flock away from him.
So that's interesting.
Yeah.
So the ideology of all of these people is anti-overseas wars.
Anti-overseas war, which is how a lot of them get to anti-Semitism.
So a little bit, but it also, so some of these people had served, right?
Mm-hmm.
And they come back feeling unsupported by the government, and like they were kind of sent on this fool's mission, and that begins the corrosion of their respect for a lot of the values that they were brought up in. But my impression from some of these people are just kind of, an idle mind is the devil's playground. Like some of these people are just kind of under challenged in their lives, a little uncertain where they're going, and this is the plaything of the moment. It's very, there's the barrier to entry to getting into the internet is incredibly low, and it rewards time. So who has time?
Yep.
The person who has the least to do.
Well, look, when the Green New Deal puts everyone back to work, this won't be an issue.
Right, exactly. So speaking of time, and Andrew having much to do, I want to thank him for coming. I urge you all, read the book, buy it, get it at the library. It's really exceptional.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody, for coming. The library is closed. The Watch on Booksellers is in the back if you'd like to buy the book, and you can exit through the doors right past the table over here. Thanks for coming, and check out our other program.